Hi, I'm Michael Hughes, and this is Contract Mastery. Let's have a look at paragraph 2 of the 1 to 4 family residential contract. Here we're talking about the property. Of course, it's important to know what the property is. We just said in paragraph 1 that the seller agrees to sell and the buyer agrees to buy the property. Well, now we have to define exactly what that is. So contract tells us that the land, the improvements, and the accessories collectively are referred to as the property with a capital P. And we'll see that word throughout the contract. And when we see it, it means the property as we have defined it here in paragraph 2. As we're going through and looking at what the property is, there are 3 components to the property that are included in the definition of property. And then we have 2 components here that are excluded from the definition of property. We talked in a separate class about paragraph 2A, which is the description of the land, that being the legal description. So go back and have a look at that class. We're going to skip over that for now and get straight into improvements. What is an improvement? Well, at the most basic level, an improvement is anything artificial that is attached to a piece of land. It's kind of hard to find a one-stop definition that works in all circumstances, but here is one from 2008 from the 8th Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. That's not the one that controls Texas, but it's a good definition. And they say, an improvement is a permanent addition to or a betterment of real property that enhances its capital value and that involves the expenditure of labor or money and is designed to make the property more useful or more valuable as distinguished from ordinary repairs. So common examples of improvements are the ones that we think about most readily: the buildings, the sidewalks, roadways, parking lots, driveways, all that sort of thing, street lights, pavements, sewer systems, water wells, all of that. But it can also include things like planting trees and landscaping if it is done artificially and it was done for the purpose of enhancing the property's value. For purposes of the 1 to 4 contract, a fixture can be considered an item of personal property that has become permanently affixed or attached to the real property so that it becomes part of and conveys with the real property. So fixtures are a type of improvement. We think of the building itself as being an improvement, and it is, right? But a fixture is a different kind of improvement. It is something that at once was personal property and has become attached to the land and now is considered part of the real property. So let's look at some examples. Anything that is built, the house, the HVAC system, the hot water heater, light fixtures, ceiling fans, doorbells, backyard kitchens, all that. Once all of this stuff becomes permanently attached, it becomes a fixture and it becomes an improvement. So if we think about a hot water heater, I drive to Home Depot, I buy a hot water heater, put it in my truck, drive it back to the house. At this point, it's personal property. But once I install it, I bolt it in place, I hook up the water, I hook up the gas, I hook up the electricity permanently. Now it's part of the house and it conveys along with the real property. That's a fixture. The reason we're talking about this is it can get a little tricky, and sometimes these become important points in our negotiations. The Texas Supreme Court has come up with a 3-part test to determine whether an item is a fixture and whether it is permanently attached to the property such that it's going to convey with the house Because if it does, we don't have to mention it. It's part of the house. It's conveying with the 1 to 4 family contract. If it is not a fixture, if it's not permanently attached, well, then the seller is free to take it with them. And they don't have to mention that at all because it's not part of the real property. So what the Texas Supreme Court tells us is here's our 3-part test. Is this item going to be damaged? Or I'm sorry, is the property going to be damaged if I remove this item? If I'm talking about a mirror that's hung on a nail on a wall, I can just pick that up and take it. It's not permanently attached. But if it's a wall-mounted mirror that's glued to the wall and I'm going to have to tear out the sheetrock in order to get the mirror, well, then that probably is a fixture. Is the item custom or is it standard? Can I just go and buy one at the store? Or was this particular item, let's say a bookshelf, built in place, custom fit to that little nook in the house? That's a custom item. And finally, what are the parties' intentions? Was this installation intended to be permanent, or was it intended to be temporary? The court tells us that the intention of the parties is the primary factor in deciding if it's a fixture. The other 2 things are evidence of the party's intention, whether the property is going to be damaged or if the item was custom or a standard item. The 1 to 4 contract lists for us a lot of common items that are considered improvements. They say the house, the garage, and all other fixtures and improvements attached to the above described real property, including without limitation, the following permanently installed and built-in items, if any. And here's the list of them. We're not going to go through the whole thing. They're in the contract. Feel free to read them. But you can see that a lot of this stuff, if it is permanently attached, yeah, it's considered part of the house. Wall-to-wall carpeting. We're not talking about area rugs. We're talking about wall-to-wall carpeting stapled down onto the floor. HVAC units, plumbing, light fixtures, chandeliers, water softening systems, kitchen equipment, garage door openers, everything that's bolted to the house. And then they have this big catch-all phrase at the end, and all other property attached to the above described real property. So a good rule of thumb is if it is permanently attached, if you would have to get a screwdriver or a hammer to move it or remove it, it probably is a fixture and it probably should convey with the house. The second category are called accessories. Here, paragraph 2C talks about the accessories. You know, there's actually no real legal definition for an accessory. This appears to be something that Trek came up with on their own. And it appears that what they're talking about are items that ordinarily would be considered personal property and therefore not part of the real estate. But these particular items are so closely connected to this property that Trek is going to require them to convey along with the realty. And they give us some good examples right in the contract. Window air conditioners, usually not bolted in. Usually they're just sitting in the window. But they're so closely connected to the property that Trek says they convey along with the house. The stove, usually not bolted in. You can normally just pull a stove away from the wall. But selling a house without a stove is usually a non-starter, so the stove goes along with the house. And all of these other items, curtain rods, blinds, window shades, draperies, a lot of stuff having to do with windows. Sounds like someone had a problem at one point. Door keys, mailbox keys, the above-ground swimming pool out in the back, it conveys with the house. If you have a swimming pool of any kind, then the swimming pool maintenance equipment and accessories convey along with the property. And then we talk about controls for garage doors, entry gates, and other improvements and accessories. And when we're talking about controls, Trek goes into a little bit more detail in their definition. And they say, in addition to the hardware, controls is going to include sellers' transferable rights to the software and applications that are used to access and control improvements and accessories. And it includes the hardware that is used solely to control the improvements and the accessories. So if we have, let's say, a garage door opener, the little gadget that clips onto your car's sun visor, that is a piece of hardware that's used to control only the garage door opener. Garage door opener is an improvement. And so the remote control goes along with it, the control device. But also, if you have an improvement that can be controlled by an app on your phone, and if there's some right that the seller owns, let's say that the app is somehow proprietary, well, that's the right that the seller owns to that software is an accessory, and it conveys along with the property. So the seller's going to have to tell the buyer how to access the app, how to control the improvement, all of that sort of thing. We're going to talk more about this sort of item when we talk about smart devices a little bit later in the contract. Now let's look at the two items that are not part of the property definition. The first one being an exclusion. The following improvements and accessories will be retained by the seller and must be removed prior to the delivery of possession. These are our exclusions. An exclusion is something that ordinarily would convey with the property. It is an improvement or an accessory, but it's something that the seller is going to keep for herself. And in doing that, she's going to exclude the item from the conveyance. It's an exclusion. Common examples of these are light fixtures, chandeliers, things like that. Drapes, window coverings, water softening systems are another one. Normally, those, of course, are plumbed into the house, and so they're considered improvements or accessories. But oftentimes sellers want to take that equipment with them. So they're going to have to specifically list the water softening system or any other improvement or accessory that they want to exclude from the contract. There is a place in paragraph 2 to list exclusions. If there are several of them, then you may want to have an exclusions list. So here's a couple of tips. Listing agents, always ask the seller about exclusions during the listing conversation. You need to develop and to use an exclusions list as part of your listing documents. So here's your seller's disclosure. Here's, I need you to sign the water district notice, the HOA, and here's your exclusions list. Have them, commonly excluded items. If any of this stuff you want to keep, or looking around, if there's anything that's permanently attached to the home that you nonetheless want to take with you, we need to list it on this list. Buyer's agents, always ask the listing agent if they have an exclusions list. Even if they don't upload one to the MLS, always ask, because you don't want to be surprised later on when the seller comes in and says, oh yeah, that chandelier is a family heirloom. We're taking that with us. And then the buyer says, well, wait, no, you're not. You always want to get this stuff ironed out at the outset. Always ask for an exclusions list, even if there's not one uploaded to MLS. TAR does have a really great form that's called What's Included in the Sale of a House. And it's a one-page form. It helps to explain what is an improvement, what is an accessory. And I always recommend including that in my listing presentation and also in my buyer packets, just to let the buyers know, hey, we may run across some items that the seller wants to remove from the property. If you want to take a look at that form, I've included the URL here that you can use to access it. There's also a QR code there. If you want to scan that on your phone, it'll pull that form up for you from the Texas Real Estate website. talk about reservations. The contract says that any reservation for oil, gas, and other minerals, water, timber, or other interests is made in accordance with an attached addendum. If you are going to reserve any property rights, you must use a separate addendum. The 1-to-4 contract does not include any reservations. Per the 1-to-4 contract, everything conveys as far as mineral interests and easements and all that, unless it is specifically excluded by the seller. So a reservation is a withholding from the conveyance of some real property interest or some feature or some part of the land. So examples of this might be if the seller wants to retain for themselves an easement. Let's say that the property is the first 5 acres of a larger, 40-acre plot. And the seller is going to need to cross over this 5-acre plot in order to get to their land. Well, they may withhold from the conveyance an easement that allows them to cross over this 5 acres at a certain defined point so that they can get to their property. If the seller wants to reserve any sort of mineral interest, oil, gas, other minerals, if they want to reserve any type of water rights, wind rights, if there's a turbine on the property, something like that, or if there is timber on the property or other sorts of growing crops, these would be things that would be reserved with a separate addendum. So there is a promulgated form, we're not going to go over it today, that is a reservation of oil, gas, etc. interests, or the parties could have an attorney prepare a specific form that would reserve these interests for the seller. So remember, the exclusions and the reservations are items that are withheld from the definition of property. If there are no exclusions, if there are no reservations, it is not necessary to attach anything else to the contract that says there are no exclusions and there are no reservations. The contract assumes that there are none of those unless the parties do something to affirmatively say, yes, we do have these things. So when we're talking about land, again, review the class on paragraph 2A, talking about legal descriptions. Improvements, anything permanently attached to the land, the house, etc. The intention of the parties is the most important factor in determining whether a item that might be personal property is a fixture and if it is an improvement. For accessories, these are items that are so closely connected to the property that they have to convey. Most of the time, they're going to be the items that are listed in the contract. For exclusions, these are items that normally would convey as part of the property, but in this case, the seller wants to keep them. They have to be specifically listed in the contract. Always either use an exclusions list if you are on the listing side or ask for an exclusions list if you're on the buy side. For reservations, this is where the seller is going to reserve for herself some legal right or some interest in the property, an easement, a mineral interest, water rights, growing crops, all that sort of thing. This requires a separate addendum to the contract. Without that separate addendum, there is nothing reserved by the 1-to-4 contract.